Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Mok. I'm the Hong Kong coordinator of Neurodiversity Pride. What is Neurodiversity Pride? Simply say, this is a week-long event between 11th June to 17th June. This is a global event, and it aims to be the time for us to celebrate our brilliantly diverse brains, celebrate our strength, and stand together in pride. Whether you're autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, bipolar, or anywhere across the neurodivergent spectrums, it's the time for us to celebrate who we are, and it's a time for us to embrace self-acceptance, to find joy, and find our community. And this is going to be the event by neurodivergent people, for neurodivergent people, and our allies. And we believe in lived experience, and this is at the heart of everything. And joining us today is Natalie Montecino. Who is Natalie? Um, I have known Natalie for a couple of years. She's a climate change activist. She's an educator. She's a youth leader. She is a World Economic Forum's global shaper, and she was a panelist at World Economic Forums 2 years ago. And she also gets involved with Davos Neurodiversity Summit. So for today, I'm glad to be joined by Natalie, and we're going to talk about her lived experience, how she learns about embracing herself, and what she wishes young people to embrace when they try to bring in neurodiversity to the community. Natalie, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Jonathan, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to celebrating Neurodiversity Pride Day with everyone.
Yes, thank you very much for this. So Natalie, let's start with this. Um, I know you are an ADHD.
Mm.
Uh, what was happening in your life that ultimately you decide to look into
Mm.
an ADHD assessment?
Mm. Yeah, that is such an interesting question. And you mentioned what was happening in my life, maybe what made me decide that it was finally time to look into an assessment. And I think actually it was what was not happening in my life that ultimately led me to seeking out an assessment. Um, I first sought an ADHD diagnosis when I was, I think, 22 or 23. So this was a few years ago. And at that time, I was finished with my undergraduate degree from the University of Colorado State, and things were sort of calming down in my life. I was starting my career, I was really becoming a leader in my own space, and it finally felt like I had a chance to breathe and to look at how I was setting up my life independent of the influence of routine, the influence of a system. I did very well in school. I really enjoyed being a student, which I know isn't always the case for ADHDers, but for me, school brought a lot of consistency to my life. And so, in the absence of school and needing to really set things up for myself, I think my version of ADHD, what ADHD means to me, became much clearer. And I was at the right stage in my life where I was independent and I could seek out assessments for myself for the first time. So yeah, that's what was going on for me at that time.
Yes, thank you very much for this. I believe that you also bring out some of the aspects of your life.
Mm.
School was a time for you to find consistency, and school was a time for you to find a space. But say after you did the assessments, after you learned that you were ADHD, what was your gut reaction?
My gut reaction was that I wonder if anyone will believe me, and I wonder if I believe me. Like I had said a few moments ago, I really loved being a student and I excelled in a school environment. And at least in the United States, there is a very prevalent stereotype that if you have ADHD, that means you perform poorly in school or you perform poorly at work until you are medicated or treating your ADHD in some way. And so up until, age 22, age 23, I hadn't sought any sort of treatment for my ADHD, but of course it had been there my entire life. And so being able to reconcile with the fact that you can be a good student and you can do well in a structured routine and also have ADHD was something that I struggled with in the beginning. And I was a little nervous to tell people because I had thought, well, maybe they'll just think I'm trying to make an excuse for myself, or they'll think that it wasn't a genuine assessment, something of that nature. And I was really happy to find that everybody with whom I shared my ADHD diagnosis was very accepting and understanding. I didn't actually encounter anyone who was like, no way do you have ADHD. That doesn't make any sense. Everyone, understood and said, you know what, I can see that in you now and tell me more about that, which I think is maybe representative of the fact that neurodiversity is becoming more accepted globally. People have a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a neurodiverse individual, which I think is a wonderful sign. And so my internal feelings about my ADHD diagnosis have definitely shifted over time. Obviously, being here in this interview and participating in many of the neurodiversity related events that I have over the past few years, it has very much become a source of pride for me and something that I embrace. I think it's critical that we have individuals of all backgrounds, of all experiences, represent the neurodiversity movement because there is not one kind of neurodiversity. There is one individual and one experience. And so, when and where it's helpful for me to bring my experience to the table and to share about that, I am always happy to do so. And so, yeah, that's been my experience over the past few years.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much for sharing this. Because but I one thing that I was thinking was you only learn about myself being ADHD at the age of 22, 23,
Mm,
and I believe that you shared it with lots of people. Some people were surprised, and some people started to think that, well, you are, yeah, I think you are an ADHD, yeah. But but you also raised the point is really about American education system and the perception of
mm,
ADHDers. They
mm,
tend to perform poorly in academic studies, and
mm,
you managed to graduate from Colorado State University,
mm, mm,
a leading state university in the U.S.
mm,
And some people also may wonder, um, you went to state university, it has more than 20 or 25,000 students, and
mhm,
the environment itself was not very structured compared to high schools. But
mm,
when you look it back, how did you manage to navigate your college years?
mm. That's a great question. Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, that in the US education system, college often is a very big difference from high school. It's a big change in routine. You have to be very self-motivated. You have to make sure that you go to class and that you do your homework, and there's not necessarily an adult presence guiding you along in the same way that some people might have in high school. Um, for me, maybe my experience was slightly different than that. I felt very well prepared for college. During my high school years, I participated in a program called the International Baccalaureate, or IB for short. This is a global curriculum that certain schools in the United States offer if they are an IB credentialed school. And in fact, I found my studying and exam schedule in high school to be much harder than anything that I did in college. And so I felt that I had the right study habits, I had the right internal motivation that college actually ended up being very fun for me because I could choose the classes that I was most interested in. I got to build great relationships with my professors and my fellow students. And also, I could remember the structure and the routine that I had built in high school during such an intensive period of my life that even when college got difficult, and I was also working simultaneously while taking classes, I felt very prepared and resourced to manage that, which I know is certainly not the case for many, many students. And one of my critiques of the US education system is that for the average student, I think we do a pretty poor job of preparing them for the challenges of higher education. I think most students enter college or enter university not knowing how to be truly independent in their studies. And for me, that wasn't the case because I had the benefit of the IB program, but that's not true for many other students.
Yes, but I think you also raised the point of being in the right environment and the point to
Hmm.
find your passions.
Hmm.
And I checked that you did international studies at college, and you also managed to find your love and passion for addressing climate change. Um,
Hmm.
how did you learn about your passions, and how did you manage to see that, well, climate change activism is my calling?
I love that question. Actually, climate change was not a big part of my university experience. I went to Colorado State University intending to study international relations and Japanese, French, all things international. I had studied abroad in high school and I really wanted to continue on that path when I entered university. And so that's what I did. I studied international development. I took Japanese language courses for the first time. I continued my French language courses. And I really just chose all of the classes that felt personally interesting to me, which was such a benefit, such a wonderful privilege to have. Because I completed many of my general education courses, so think math, science, writing. I completed those during high school and received college credit for them in high school. So really, when I started university, it was almost as if I was starting, with a year or 2 years of college already completed, which meant I got to take all the fun classes. So by the time I actually graduated from university, I then decided to apply for a Fulbright research grant to Japan. And this is where my journey with climate change actually started. Um, and it didn't start at the beginning, it kind of happened spontaneously for me during my research grant. But I was awarded a research scholarship to live in Japan for about 10 months. And the research theme that I had identified in my application was the power of tradition. How do rural communities in Japan leverage their traditional cultures, their history to become places of renewal, right? I think many people have heard that Japan is experiencing some really steep population decline. They have an aging population, there's not as many children being born. And that problem that the entire country of Japan is facing is even more concentrated in its rural areas. And so I've always been interested in rural communities. My family is from rural Louisiana here in the United States. And so I wanted to go abroad and see, well, what techniques, what methods are rural communities in Japan using to actually bring young people, to bring international people back to the countryside to revive those areas. And I went in with that very, very broad research question and a lot of curiosity because I didn't know the answer before starting this research project. I was very lucky to be partnered with Okayama University in southern Japan. I had a fantastic host family, a fantastic research advisor, and I got to spend a lot of time in the field interviewing rural residents and traveling across the prefecture of Okayama to experience for the first time in my life what it's like to live in a rural Japanese community. And over the course of my research, over the course of those 10 months, one thing became very clear to me, which is that no matter what community you are in, your natural resources, the thing that your community has kind of naturally, right? Maybe it's timber, or maybe you have a nearby ocean that the fishing industry relies on. Whatever it may be, your natural resources are really critical to your local economy and to your local sense of self. So every community that I visited in Okayama had some sort of tie to their natural resources that they had relied on historically, and maybe they were or maybe they were not relying on it currently, but they had a desire to recenter that natural resource in their day-to-day activities. And so observing that in practice and seeing just how critical the environment, the natural resources were to the future of rural livelihoods, I started to get really interested in the impact that climate change is already having, or maybe will have in the next few years, on that local environment and on those local resources. And so by the time I completed my 10-month research grant and I moved back to the United States, I knew that I wanted to spend more time researching this, testing out ideas in a US context because like Japan, as one of the, very developed nations in the world, we are heading down the same path of population decline and an aging population. And so if we can learn from the lessons that Japan is experiencing kind of ahead of the curve, maybe we can be better prepared to manage those challenges in the United States as well.
Yes, you also raised the point of um, one of the key areas of sustainable development that is creating an environment um, for urban and rural areas
Hmm.
uh, to um, to be habitable places for people from different walks of life. And
Yeah.
your experience in Japan is like transforming for you, I believe.
Mhm.
Um, but speaking of your ADHD, um, how did you manage to leverage it
Mm.
as you were doing research in Japan?
Mm. That's a fun question. My research in Japan actually preceded my ADHD diagnosis, so I didn't have any formal piece of paper saying you have ADHD at that time, but I knew in myself that my approach to life, the way that I think about things, the way that I think about systems, was a little bit different. And so I used that to my advantage in a research context. One of the stereotypes about Japan, which is sometimes true, sometimes not, is that it can be a very rule-oriented society, right? There's a lot of written rules. There's also a lot of unspoken rules. And people can sometimes, in certain contexts, be very rigid about following things and thinking about things the way that they have always been. Of course, that's not to make a general statement about all of Japan. There is so much innovation happening in the country all the time. But compared to maybe the United States or some other Western countries, it can be a more, yeah, tradition or rule-oriented society. But one of the advantages, I think, of being a neurodiverse thinker is that rules are not always the first thing that come to mind when you are living your life, right? You are just experiencing life as you always have, and you might be a little bit more willing than perhaps a neurotypical person to challenge the status quo. And so, in a research context, I think for me that meant that I could be a little bit braver. I could be a little bit bolder in some of the questions that I asked. I could be a little bit bolder in some of the directions that I took with my research. And it occasionally surprised people And they would say, I hadn't thought about it that way before. Or, we've never tried that before, but if you're willing to lead, we'll give it a try. And so I was very lucky to the point that you made earlier, Jonathan, about having the right environment, having an accepting environment. I was very lucky that my kind of research environment, the people that were supporting me in Japan, were very open to my way of thinking and ultimately wanted to support my journey and allow me to experience all parts of my Fulbright to the fullest extent possible. And so, even if I was challenging maybe the tradition or, yeah, challenging the way people normally go about things, I had a very, very supportive community that gave me the space to do that and showed me how to do that in a way that still respected the local culture, the local history, and the rules that need to be followed. So yeah, to summarize, I think even not knowing at the time that I was a formal ADHDer, I think I was emboldened by my neurodiversity and my unique way of thinking to really push the limits of my research. And I was lucky to have a supportive group to make that possible.
Yes, I think this is a very noble goal. It's also really about leveraging evidence-based studies um,
Hmm.
to inform stakeholders um, why sustainability really matters.
Hmm.
And I know that once you complete your Fulbright studies in Japan, you wear multiple hats. You work for climate democracy initiatives, and um, you and your team has been dedicated to addressing climate change, addressing climate change through uh, governance in different parts of the in the U.S.,
Mhm.
primarily in Colorado.
Mhm.
You also um, teach classes relating to Japan.
Mhm.
But say focusing on your advocacy work, um,
Mhm.
you need to do the work. You need to persuade stakeholders.
Mhm.
You also need to um, lead people. And how do you leverage your ADHD?
Mm. Yeah. In many of the same ways that I did during my Fulbright grant, I find my ADHD comes to be a strength in the work that I do now with the Climate Democracy Initiative. The in the United States, there have been two separate fields, the climate change field and the democracy field, for a very long time, right? These are well-established groups, well-established ways of being. But to bring them together to say, let's do climate change in the context of democracy is, at least at the time when we started doing this work in 2023, that was a bit of an uncomfortable conversation. I'm happy to report that now in the United States, I think partially from our efforts and the efforts of the many partners that we work with, the conversation of climate change and democracy together is becoming much more common. And in fact, we're seeing many more groups adopt a dual focus than ever before. But in the beginning of the work, as I said, it was very uncomfortable. In fact, I remember a conversation that I had with somebody in Washington, D.C. during my first, I don't know, maybe 4 months of being with the Climate Democracy Initiative. I took a trip to Washington, D.C. with my boss, and we were sitting in the office of someone who was, very well respected in the democracy field. He had been doing this work for decades, was very well known in Washington, D.C. and across the world. And he told us, you're crazy to try to do the combining of climate and democracy. You're never going to be able to get those two fields to work together. It's a waste of effort. You'd be better off doing climate change work like this and democracy work like this. And that was a very impactful conversation for me to have so early on in my career with the Climate Democracy Initiative. But I think like my my ADHD and my stubbornness and just my own approach to life really allowed me to hear that critique and say, well, I'm gonna try anyway. I know that there's something here. I want to push on the boundaries of what has been and try something new. And I think, again, I had the support of very passionate board members. I had wonderful colleagues at the Climate Democracy Initiative, and I still do, that, upon hearing those critiques as well, said, hey, we're going to try anyway. So let's keep pushing, let's keep trying. And so that same boldness that I think neurodiversity can give us absolutely came into play in my career as well. But Jonathan, you had mentioned, in the beginning of your question, the need to really have a systemic or systematic approach, I should say, to conducting work, right? Like we have to bring academic rigor to the work that we do. We need to be able to work with other stakeholders and create a methodology that is readily understood by people who are not us. And so sometimes I think that can be a challenge for ADHDers and maybe other people with different kinds of neurodiversity. But this is another instance where I could really rely on and call back the structure from my university days and my high school days, and also now my Fulbright days, as to like, what does it mean to be a good researcher? What methods do we use? How do we show that our work is validated beyond our own internal thinking? And it certainly required me to challenge myself and get better at taking all of the ideas that I had swirling around in my brain and try to put them on paper and try to share them with people who think differently than me and have them understand what my goal is, what my intention is. And that's not always an easy task, particularly with two areas, climate change and democracy, which, at least in the United States, are very polarizing topics, right? There are large sections of the US population that maybe don't believe in climate change or don't support acting on climate change from an official governance standpoint. And so in the US, we have to work really, really hard to move past the stereotypes and some of the mis and disinformation that have really latched on to these fields of climate change and democracy and be able to reach people around the values that they have and the things that they really care about in their day-to-day life. And so that was my challenge and another place where I think my neurodiversity could come into play because I understand what it means to be able to be on the receiving end of communication that doesn't always make sense or doesn't speak to my way of thinking. And so I think having had that experience myself, I could then apply that to my work and say, okay, how do we use plain language? How do we get really clear about our message and our goal so that anyone in the world can understand it? And now I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think you also raised the point. The point is really about accepting yourself, embracing
hmm
who you are,
hmm
and leverage your strength. Um, but I think you also raised the point. The point was to acknowledge the challenges facing you, and these challenges um, could be traced back to the time you were a college student. Um,
hmm
but say, what challenges do you have as an ADHD? And
Mm,
what do you do to address these challenges?
mm. Yeah, I think I have some of the classic challenges for sure. I love to start a new project. I love to start, researching something really, really heavily for a few days when my motivation is super, super high. And then all of a sudden, my motivation goes like this, and I have a very difficult time continuing the work. So, in in a work context, in a career context, it's not always looked favorably upon to have a bunch of projects that you're starting but never finishing. And so even though that's my impulse is to always be trying new things and maybe putting them down and picking them back up again. I needed to challenge that challenge and say, okay, if I'm going to dedicate my time, I've only got 40 hours a week to move my work forward. I need to be very intentional about what projects I start and strategic about when I put them down and when I continue them. And so I have really leaned into creating like annual work plans for myself that I update on a quarterly basis, sometimes on a monthly basis even, so that I'm not just spinning my wheels day in and day out, but I can actually step back and look at the larger picture for the month, look at the larger picture for the year and say, where am I trying to end up? What's my direction? Where am I driving to? And for me, in my experience with ADHD, in the day to day, sometimes I can lose sight of what the bigger goal is. And so creating systems for myself that allow me to revisit the bigger picture, allow me to revisit why am I doing all of this work in the first place has been really, really helpful for me. And I find that during those periods where my motivation goes like this, where my motivation disappears, actually being able to revisit the bigger picture is one of the ways that I can start to increase my motivation again and say, all right, I'm not ready to put this down yet. Let me work a little bit more on it. So that's definitely one of the challenges that I have faced. A bit of an unexpected challenge as well. At the beginning of our interview, I spoke about how when I first got my ADHD diagnosis, it was pretty well received by everybody that I told about the ADHD diagnosis. I didn't have anybody, accusing me that maybe it was a lie or being shocked by it. But as my career has progressed and as I have earned more credentials, had more experiences, I find that people that I'm meeting, people who I'm meeting in maybe more elite spaces can be a bit judgmental when you tell them that you have ADHD. Maybe they have a friend or like maybe they know a colleague's son has ADHD. And so when you first tell them, you can kind of see a little bit of a look of shock on their face, like, oh, you have ADHD, but you're also here in this very elite space. How did that happen? And so I'm finding myself to still be a bit unprepared for the instances where that does happen. But going back to my point of how do we communicate our goals and our intentions to anyone in the world? How do we speak clearly to anyone in the world? The same is true of communicating about neurodiversity. And so if I notice that somebody might be a little shocked or confused that a neurodiverse person is in the same space as them, or that maybe I don't fit their image of what a neurodiverse person is, I take that as an opportunity to practice communicating plainly and clearly about the breadth and depth of the neurodiverse experience and to ask them questions about their life and the way that they approach the world, the way that they think about things. And I find that to be a really great bridging exercise because even if the person that I'm talking to is not neurodiverse, has never thought about neurodiversity in a serious way, the truth is that every person in the world has their own unique way of seeing the world, their own unique lens, their own unique approach. And so, if we can focus on our strengths and maybe some of the challenges that we've addressed, then the neurodiversity conversation is truly a conversation for everyone, in my mind.
I think you also raised the point. The point is, some of the people have the fixed ideas of what ADHD is look like.
Hmm. Hmm.
And some of the people could be shocked when you disclose what is normally considered stigma.
Mm.
And in my experience, when I talk about my autism and ADHD, most of the time people started talking about their children,
Mm.
relatives, or the children of their friends.
Hmm.
And as they were asking me about what action could be taken, I could not stop thinking about these little children. They're gonna
Mm.
grow up one day and they're gonna become young people. And
Hmm.
I know that you are a global shipper and you
Hmm.
have chances of working with young leaders from different walks of life. And I
Hmm.
can imagine that some of the young leaders themselves are neurodivergent. Some of them wish to be the allies of the neurodivergent community for whatever
Hmm.
reasons, possibly because they have siblings who are neurodivergent. And what is the message you would like um, to deliver to them?
Mm. Yeah, I think you're right. And maybe the message that's coming to mind for me is one that I think, or I hope, will be resonant for young people, but also for adults who maybe are starting their neurodiversity journey later in life. I've met many women, in fact, who have come to learn that they are ADHD in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s. And that's a whole nother conversation that we could have about how ADHD looks different in women than it does in men, and where our fixed understanding of what ADHD means is actually very much centered around men, but that's another conversation. But my point is that the message I want to share, I hope, is resonant for everyone, regardless of age, but maybe especially for young people. And that message is to be curious about yourself first before you are curious about the world, or maybe while you're curious about the world, also be curious about yourself. Because when you know yourself and when you know the lens through which you are seeing the world, you can better make sense of the pictures that you're seeing. You can better make sense of the information that you're receiving. And so if you don't pause to really, take off the metaphorical glasses, so to speak, and to look at them and to turn them around and say, well, what filter do I have on these glasses? Where are they helping me see better? And where do I need maybe some more support to see the things that my glasses aren't helping me to see? I think you'll miss so much in the world if you don't do that assessment. And so, whether or not that looks like receiving a formal diagnosis or, involving medical professionals in your journey, I don't think that that's important. I think there is so much that you can do introspectively and in community with friends, in community with family, colleagues. And so, while of course I will always encourage people to seek validation from the medical field when and where it's helpful to do so, that's not the only path for really understanding yourself, for being curious about yourself. And I think one of the best things that we can do for society and many of the challenges that we face day in and day out as a society, the best place to start is by being curious about yourself and the way that you are approaching the world and being clear that maybe this is the way I've been approaching the world previously. Is that the way that I want to continue approaching the world? Or should I try another angle? Should I try another path? And I don't think you'll know that unless you really do some of that assessment. So, yes, be curious about yourself, be curious about others, and be curious about the world.
That's a very impactful message. Be curious about the world and be curious about others. Um,
Hmm.
I believe can be the key for us to empowering the community,
Hmm.
with Leo inclusion being one of the outcomes of curiosity. Again, thank you very much, Natalie, for your time today. I believe that we have learned a lot about your journey, from learning about yourself and ADHD to knowing your strength and eventually leveraging your strength to combine two meaningful causes, climate change and policies together for make our community an even better place.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this opportunity. It's been such a pleasure to know you for the past few years, and I'm glad that we can continue championing this message of neuro-inclusivity in the years ahead. So thank you for this opportunity. And to anyone watching this interview, thank you for making it this far. And I hope you will be curious about yourself, curious about your others, and curious about the world with really kindness at your core. So thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you very much to everyone. So I definitely believe that this interview is just the beginning of many steps towards neo inclusion. But let us take the step together. Goodbye, everyone. And Natalie, should we say goodbye as well?
Yes, goodbye, everyone. Hope to see you soon.